Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I didn't hear from you. Is it because you haven't had lunch or what is happening? Well, what you're watching in front of you, there's good news and there's bad news. I'll start with bad news. You're watching a less eloquent version of Barack Obama. The good news is it's a version that is a little bit more hopeful about the future of Europe. After all, even Brexit, we can find a way of putting brakes to the exit. Before you, we will be discussing a topic that's a little bit more controversial, sometimes uncomfortable, but at the time such as the one we're facing, sometimes we have to deal with inconvenient truths. Our topic today for this session is going to be fuel to the fire, weaponizing Islam in Europe. Now, for students of history, you must be aware that for about 13 centuries, the dominance of political Islam held a lot of currency. Of course, this came to an end with the fall or the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And for about 100 years, there's been a struggle, especially within the Islamic world or Muslim-dominated lands, on how to establish a legitimate form of government. This struggle has been sometimes what they call voices that are moderate and voices that are extreme. Now, the Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS is testament to the inability to answer this question. Now, the panelists before you are going to help us walk through the contours of political Islam. It has had an effect not just in the Middle East, but actually here in Europe. Increasingly, we have seen political profiteers use the phobia associated with Islam or Islamism for political mobilization. Of course, often with some detrimental results at the ballot box, especially for those who believe in liberal democracy, free speech, and inclusivity. Now, our audience before you, Emmanuel, Abduwari, and Kemadu, they work in this area. They have extensive competence, both in academia and as Islamic scholars. And I encourage that we are going to be as interactive as possible without limiting our ideas or perhaps trying to be diplomatically too careful. Now, I'd like to remind our audience that translating kids are right by your chair. It will be a translation from Arabic to English for one of our panelists. And that you can also ask questions using Slido, which if you go to slido.com with the code GOBSEC 2019, so we can be able to share with our panelists and get appropriate responses. Now, Emmanuel, some people are wondering in this room, the elephant that in the room that is rarely discussed, especially because of political correctness. To what extent is political Islam prevalent in Europe? Is it a threat to European values? Is it so widespread that we need to build bigger walls? What's your opinion? What's your take on that?
Well, I won't be politically correct. That is not how I work. But as an academic, I think it's important to speak precisely of what the question is. Political Islam has always been in the grassroots of Islam. As you all know, the Quran replaces a constitution. And in some cases, a certain number of Muslim states are abiding by that. And there is this uprising again of this will to transform national states and to replace constitution by Sharia. This is the case actually in Sudan, as you are very well aware of, where a certain number of actors are calling for the Sharia to be the new constitution or to pursue the constitution. So the question is whether or not the constitution of modern states, European states, can be compatible with people who accept it or do not accept it. And I think this is the combat or the issue about those who are wanting to instrumentalize politically Islam. I don't like the term political Islam because, again, Islam has always been political. It has always been has this issue of governing, both spiritually and, I must say, on a secular base. But the politicization of Islam, which we are seeing both in Europe and in other countries, is something that interrogates our own system of values. Our constitutions, our, in French we say vivre ensemble, living together capability, are challenged by this because we haven't taken sufficiently in consideration the multiculturalism of our states and of our society. And this is particularly true in France, where we've been a bit stubborn about this issue, not comparing with Great Britain or with other Anglo-Saxon states, but it is, again, an issue. I think, to finish and to be rapid, and hope we'll be rapid and precise on this issue, Islam is not a threat to Europe for a very historical reason. Europe has been living with Islam for 500 years. Al-Andalus Kingdom was a reality in Spain, both in Spain and in the north and southern shores of Mediterranean. The first diplomatic relation between between Persia, and France, and thus Europe, dates from 1750, 300 years ago. Scholars in French academia, for example, have been studying Arabic for almost 400 years in Collège de France and in Sorbonne. So it's not a new issue. What is new is the fact that it is willing for, well, to rephrase that, some have a political agenda more than a cultural and civilization agenda, and I think this is not a threat, but something we have to address in another way.
Yeah, I'm just curious, why now? Are there forces perhaps behind it? For a very long time we had lived without the threat of political Islam.
Well, there's definitely an agenda, again, and a political agenda with some states using that. Religious diplomacy. Everyone knows that KSA, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has engaged a certain number of money, a certain number of actions, and taking a certain number of actions on that behalf. There is a momentum in which states are using more and more proxy actors to fulfill this agenda. This is true with Hezbollah, with Iran. This is true maybe with the Muslim Brotherhood, with linked to, of course, historically to Al-Banna, but again, something we can find not only in Egypt, but in all the southern parts of the Mediterranean. So it's a new agenda, again, that we have not been addressing in a correct way. We are addressing it in a security process. We're not trying to understand that the dynamics inside the Muslim society are the same that Europe has experienced 1,000 years ago, between the difference of modernizing Islam or Islamization of modernity. We lived this during the Renaissance period in Europe, when, with the reform, we interrogated what was faith and what was, in Francais we say reason. I don't know if you translate that in English, but you believe or you act. And this is croire ou et gouverner, to govern. So this, I think, has not sufficiently, to repeat myself, been addressed as something that we have experienced in Europe, and which is, I think, now traversing a certain number of societies. This was quite true just after, as a milestone, one of the milestones of the Arab Spring in 2011, and what is happening now in Algeria and Sudan, but I think we could go back on that issue afterwards.
Yeah, Dr. Wario, it's interesting to know what exactly is happening, because we have seen, especially, at least based on the documents that the ISIS has been producing, they tend, or rather at least they claim to extend their caliphate way beyond the Levant. We've seen Boko Haram, we've seen Al-Shabaab on the other end, and parts of the former Soviet Union, we've seen them in Chechnya. What is happening? What is driving? What's the narrative that's driving these groups?
Thank you so much, Chair. I would like to start from the point that when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in a couple of years back declared that he has established a caliphate and self-appointed himself as the first caliph after the fall of the after the fall of the Ottoman Empire during the Second World War, 40,000 people from all over the world turned up to join this caliphate. What does this really mean about the political nature of Muslim communities across the world? But perhaps we need to understand this aspiration among certain constituencies, perhaps even based within Europe, how they vision governance structure should be. So we saw hundreds and hundreds of Europeans from all over turning up to be part of this. The thing that we need to also put into perspective is the nature of the states in which Muslims live, especially outside Europe. This crisis of states. States are not necessarily functioning the way they are. They are not necessarily democratic enough. Or those who live within Europe feel as if they are disenfranchised. They feel probably their cultural aspects are not necessarily captured within the secular system they live in. So they aspire to live in pious system that sorts of appear to apply the Islamic tenet to the very limit. But of course, behind groups like ISIS, behind groups like Al-Shabaab, behind groups like Al-Qaeda, religion is generally instrumentalized for political end. It's a new form of statecraft that is at play, largely that sits opposite to the neoliberal state that we have across the world. And so when you look at the experience of political Islamism currently, there are a couple of countries perhaps that are experimenting with different form of Islamism, say Turkey or Egypt under Morsi, or some parties, for instance, in Middle East or in Tunisia, like in Nahda and so on. So there is quite diverse expression of what political Islamism is. And it's a mixed bag of success and failure. For instance, in the case of Egypt, for instance, despite the fact that this person was elected on some kind of popular legitimate vote, he couldn't inclusively administer the country enough for it to be considered as one unit. So we see crises continuously also appearing within different experimentation of Islamism. So I could put it that way.
Now we have seen some states have been accused of sponsoring some of these organizations, state sponsors of terror. To what extent, and are there any states that come to mind that perhaps are contributing to the growth and expansion of these groups?
It's a very shady area to actually, put a finger into who could actually be sponsoring states to terrorism. For instance, Sudan has been for a long period associated with the sponsor of state terrorism, and we saw the sanctions that were placed on them for over 20 years because they hosted Al-Qaeda's chief, Osama bin Laden, for a couple of years, and so the sanctions were placed on them. So though these are very political statements that are used by the world powers, especially to sanction states that are affiliated in one way or another with radicalization and terrorism, but Muslim states, Muslim majority states, especially in the Middle East or Turkey and so on, are interested in migrant communities that are living in Europe in one way or another, and they have either support for most communities or associations that continuously look back at home countries as examples from which they could borrow Islamic ideas.
I think Emmanuel would like to...
I don't want to pinpoint precisely the states that you're mentioning, but the ideology that is fueling a certain number of these groups go back to the end of the 80s. And precisely the expansionism, the will to try to convert a certain number of Muslim states who were living under, for example, Sufi legitimacy or Sufi history. I'm thinking of West Africa, have been under pressure by an ongoing and very diplomatic strategy of expansion of Wahhabism, which is a reality. I'm not pushing on one state, but again, we do know where it has started and how this state is amplifying on that. But that is true, that there has been a certain number of social pressure, a sort of will to use civil society, charities, NGOs, to try to change the narrative. That is, not having a national agenda, but an Ummah agenda, or an agenda coming from abroad. I'm not saying that has fueled a certain number of insurgency, terrorist groups, or irredentist militias, but again, there is a sort of chronology, a link between chronology and that reality.
Now, Kemadu, what is the relationship between I think you'll need your translation kits from Arabic to English. Yeah, so what do you think is the relationship between Islam and political Islam? Are there certain Islamic precepts that perhaps are informing the actions of political Islam or extremist ideology, for instance? Yeah, I was asking if are there any Islamic precepts within the Quran, for instance? Yeah, are there any Islamic precepts within the Quran that perhaps are informing the actions and the direction of political Islam and extremist ideology? I think a lot of people around the world sometimes wonder whether there is actually a connection inherently between Islam and, for instance, terrorism and extremism.
Translate.
What is the channel? What is the channel?
The channel. Yeah. Yeah. I think. Yeah, it's working now. That's what technology does sometimes. It misbehaves at the most inopportune time. Yeah, the question, Gesame, that you can help us perhaps, walk us through, is there a relationship between Islam and the rise of political Islam? Is there something inherent within Islam that informs the rise of this ideology and political Islam?
It doesn't work.
Translation.
Normally it should work.
Let's say. Yes, yes. I think as we still work out the technology bit, we're going to move into,
You want me to translate in French? I can translate.
Iman, you want to translate in French?
Yeah, repeat and I'll translate in French.
Yes. So, is there anything inherently within Islam that perhaps is informing the actions of terrorist organizations and political Islam? Well,
Okay.
I think we'll come back to that later. Now, our next question goes to Emmanuel. Emmanuel?
Huh? Don't speak in the microphone, just listen.
Yeah.
Just listen.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think we can proceed now, and we're going to sort that out later. So,
أيوة الإسلام السلام عليكم الإسلام دين متكامل ونحن في القرن الرابع عشر للإسلام من بداية الإسلام إلى يومنا هذا وهذا وقت طويل في حياة الأمم وليس بقريب على كل حال فالإسلام كانت هناك دول ودول سقطت والآن نحن اليوم في تحول آخر في مجال العالم كله ما يأتي للإسلام يأتي لجميع الأديان ويأتي لجميع الشعوب أما ما يقوله على أن الإسلام هل يمكن أن يساير هذا الزمن فهذا أنا أقوله شيء بأكيد لأن الإسلام ساير الأوقات كلها إلى يومنا هذا ولم نجد فيه أي تحريف لكن الذي حدث في القريب تقريبا في نهاية القرن الماضي إلى هذا القرن الذي نعيشه حاليا تحول من الإرهاب وما إلى ذلك. كل هذا الإسلام ليس له علاقة بهذه الأمور كلها. فمجرمون يقومون بأعمال لا صلة لها بالدين، ثم نأتي نقول الإسلاميين أو الإسلاميون. كل هذا اتهام على الإسلام ولا مبرر لها. الإسلام الذي نعرفه إسلام متسامح وعاشت ما لا يقل عن 14 قرن يساير الزمن، وليس هناك حرب بين الإسلام وبين أي دولة أخرى. هذا ما شاهدناه وهذا ما تعلمناه في الماضي. فإننا الإسلام في كل البلاد التي أعرفها متساير. أما ما حدث في بداية هذا القرن هذا لا نستطيع أن نسميه بأن هذا هو الإسلام على كل حال، ويجب أن نبعد ذلك عن الإسلام ولا نقول أن هذا هو الإسلام. الإسلام دين، وهذا الدين ناس يتدينون به في كل مكان ويتعايشون مع غيرهم. ونحن في فرنسا عندنا ما نسميه بمؤتمر أئمة فرنسا. هذا المؤتمر يقوم بأعمال كبيرة جدا لتفهيم الناس أن ما يجري من أعمال من العنف الإسلام بريء عنه على كل حال، وهذا ما يجب أن نفهمه في كل مكان ما نحن فيه.
Yeah, but you say that it has nothing to do with Islam, and yet these groups claim to do it in the name of Islam. Now, how can you convince the rest of the world that it's not Islamic?
بالتأكيد الإنسان عندما يقوم بإجرام من الإجرامات في الدنيا دائما يحاول أن يوصله بشيء آخر، لكن الدين الإسلامي كما قلت لا علاقة له بالإرهاب الذي نشاهده في كل مكان. فعندما يقوم إنسان مسجون في السجون سنوات عديدة ويخرج من السجن ويقوم بإجرام من الإجرامات، سواء كان مسيحيا أو يهوديا أو مسلما، فهل يعني ذلك أن هذا الشخص الذي قام بهذا الإجرام في مكان أن نسمي بأنه على أنه كان مسلما يجب أن يكون ذلك هو عمل الإسلامي؟ طبعا لا، نحن لا نقبل ذلك. نحن نعرف بالتأكيد أن الإسلام دين متسامح ودين عمل طوال العقود أو القرون الماضية لإسعاد البشرية، وهذا ما نحن فيه. نحن في فرنسا قمنا بأعمال كثيرة بقافلات لإعلام الناس على أن ما يجري في العالم حاليا ليس من عمل الإسلام، والإسلام لا يقبله بحال من الأحوال، وهذا ما نجده الأئمة يدعون بها في كل مكان. فمن هنا ومن هنا نجد الناس إرهابيين يقومون بأعمال دنيئة ويريدون أن ينسبوه إلى الإسلام. ومن السهل جدا أن نقول أنهم مسلمون، صحيح، جماعة يبيعون المخدرات، جماعة يعملون بالإجرامات وإجراماتهم، كيف ننسب هذا إلى الإسلام؟ الإسلام لا يقبل هذا. يجب أن يكون الشيء الذي يتعلق بالإسلام منسوب إلى أناس لهم اليد على الإسلام بالذات، مفتيين، أناس مسؤولين، أناس جمعيات مثلا، هيئات كبيرة، وهذا غير موجود. فلم نسمع بذلك أبدا أن هيئات مثل الأزهر دعا إلى الإرهاب أو هيئات مثل جامعة مدينة المنورة دعا إلى الإرهاب. لا، هؤلاء كلهم يدافعون عن الإسلام ولا يريدون أن يقوم. فكيف نستطيع أن نسند عمل إنسان مجرم، إنسان مجرم موجود في السجن، أن نسمي عمله بأنه هو على أنه مسلم فقط؟ يجب أن نسند هذا العمل إلى الإسلام. هذا نحن نرفضه ونرفضه في كل مكان، ليس ذلك بإسلام. فالإسلام دين متسامح.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank Emmanuel for the translating, in French for us. But I have a question for you, Emmanuel. We've seen what is happening increasingly in Europe. You have a lot of young men and women crossing over to go to the Middle East, to fight in jihad or for whatever cause they think. What are we doing in Europe to make sure that we actually reduce this problem of extremist recruiting from home? You find decent kids who have access to education, come from middle-class families, but they still find themselves in there, and it becomes problematic for us to get them back because we don't know exactly what we're dealing with. What do you think Europe should do to make sure that this problem does not continue?
Well, first of all, it's not a problem only that Europe has to tackle. There approximately was 5,000 foreign fighters who went to Syria coming from Europe, about the same coming from the Middle East, well, North Africa and Middle East. And it is a matter of concern for the African Union, as Mohamed Faki, the president of the Commission of the African Union, mentioned it frequently. So it's not only a problem about Europe. Secondly, I think the problem is not saying that they go to Syria or they went to Syria or to Iraq, more recently to Libya, and more anciently in Afghanistan for social reasons, because they're not integrated and because Europe has not mentioned or has not managed to integrate all of the communities. I do prefer communities more than ethnies. There is no ethnies in France. There's no community, by the way, but that's another question. So the issue, I think, I wanted to raise that after the intervention of a colleague, because a certain number of European countries, not to say United States, have, I think, thought in the outskirts of the Arab Springs that political Islam was the worst solution, because they were fearing that if they were not sustaining or they would not sustain political Islam parties, and this is quite true in Tunisia, with the rise of Ennahda. As you know, Hanouchi made his studies in Great Britain and has a certain number of contacts with American scholars in NYU and in Fordham University in New York. I think a certain number of countries, and again, I will speak more precisely on my country, I thought that sustaining political Islam was a solution in order to prevent the state to go and to shift to violent extremism. I'm not saying we made a mistake on that, but again, this was the narrative between 2010 and 2011. And this was a narrative, by the way, with a certain number of Maghreb countries. For example, when there was a change of constitution in Morocco in 2011, which saw the rise of the PGD, the Justice and Democratic Party, the Development Party, which is still in power, that was one of the responses that the king, Mohammed VI, thought was convenient. Not the same response in Algeria, when the FIS and now the MSP were pushed aside, even though they won the election in 1991. So I think this is really important to address maybe your question, saying it's not about Islam, it's about political agenda again. People went in Syria not based on the fact that they were doing a jihad, but based on the fact that they were pushing again for a geopolitical agenda, and this is quite true, maybe truer, maybe in Libya, where there is absolutely no religious essence in the fact that Daesh is becoming to, even though it has been pushed already in 2016 in the Libyan shores. So political agenda. Then there's the geopolitical agenda. We already mentioned that. Based on the fact that now I see coming a new political agenda. We are now in the post-revolutionary stance. Morsi is no longer in power in Egypt. So the Brotherhood was put aside, Muslim Brotherhood was put aside in Egypt. Ennahda, even though is not in power, but still represents 40% of the electoral votes in Tunisia, which is important because, as you all know, Hanouchi, its chief, has said 3 days ago that he will be running for the presidency by the end of the year. And in Algeria, and maybe more in Sudan, we see that this is, again, becoming more and more an agenda. The people who went on the streets were saying 3 things: liberty, civil rights, no Sharia. We don't want Sisi, and we don't want external ingerence, external interferences. This is exactly what happened again in Mali. And again, maybe I can address and respond precisely to your question. How do we address the fact that a certain number of French, born French, went to fight in Syria and Libya? Well, first of all, we have to address the fact that a certain number of French citizens have not had the impression that they were equal to rights and didn't have the same access to what the Republic was giving them. Maybe to be preciser on this, there is no statistic, no religious, no ethnic statistic in France. So we don't know precisely who is Muslim and who is not Muslim. It would be discriminatory to say you are Muslim because you come from Algeria. They may not be Muslim. They may not be practitioner. We think that only 6% of the French population is linked to Islam by history and not by practice of religion. So that would make more or less something like 6 to 7 million Muslims in France. They are French nationally, but practicing Islam. But among these 6 million, only 1.5 million are believers and practitioners of the religion. So again, pushing aside the religious aspects. And I think one of the comparison which is accurate is saying that in some cases, religion, I'm not saying Islam, religion can be a sort of replacement of what the state does not do. We have the phenomenon of center and peripheria. All of these terrorists, irredentists, militias, guerrilla groups grow in areas very far from the administrative centers of this country. That means that the state has withdrawn. And when the state withdrawn, it happened in 1950s in Italy, in Sicilia, when someone replaces that criminal organization. I think we have to link that not to religion, but to the fact that when the state is not there, you have someone willing to push aside the state and replace it. Offer justice, offer work capability, and of course, offer a political future. So I'm not sure I respond to your question, but I think this is important to have in mind.
Thank you. Wari, I was just wondering, we know how religionization of politics and politicization of religion, what it can do, especially with regard to coexistence and harmony. Now, in the light of what is happening today in our current world, we also understand that, especially those who practice in the field of countering violent extremism, that moderate voices are very important in the fight against extremism. Now, from your experience, what do you think Europe should do, especially in empowering moderate voices, especially of the Islamic leaders? And are they even doing enough? Are Islamic leaders actually doing enough to fight back against the terrorist narrative?
I will borrow some examples from Africa, in this case, Kenya's case. Kenya neighbors Somalia, and Somalia has been a failed state since 1991. And by 2005, the warlords, Islamic State Court Union had taken over. Al-Shabaab rose in this power vacuum that my colleague has also discussed. When the state is no longer working well, especially in these parts of the world, chances of individuals ganging up and instrumentalizing religion for purpose of building a new form of state polity is extremely possible. Now the question now rises to issue of moderate leaders. there's been experimentation across the world, for instance, of voices that are alternative to the ones of say, Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. One of the biggest crises that faces these forms of voices is legitimacy. Are they individuals that are considered considerably across the swath of Europe as individuals who can give directions that will be followed by the youth? When youth, especially young people, take positions that are contrary to those of both the state in which they live and the religious leaders that lead their communities, they are often inclined not to listen to this kind of moderation. But by and large, despite the fact that these voices might not be listened to, they need to be supported. The experience, for instance, from Kenya is, and East Africa is that when these campaigns that are usually called counter-violent extremism involves the communities better, chances of this agenda being accepted across by many stakeholders is strong. So if their legitimacy is good enough, if they are authoritative enough to give directions within their societies, if they do not also engage in exclusion of other voices within their own circles, perfect. But getting such groups of individuals is something that needs to be nurtured within individual countries rather than across Europe. Because, say, someone could enjoy extreme position of authority, say in Netherlands or in Germany or in France, and these voices need to be nurtured as country-specific voices that are going to guide communities up, towards the path of moderation and fighting violent extremism. In addition, whether it is real or not, those perceived grievances that individuals cite as reasons for going to join violent extremist group must be addressed by the society and must involve much more of communities themselves than state security agencies or any other partner that is seen as alien by these communities. And I think to finalize, examples need to be borrowed within Europe, and people need to learn from each other's experience on how to address this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that contribution. Perhaps 30 seconds.
I wanted to address that in another way. The problem we have concerning the intermediate forces, what we call in French l'Islam des Lumières, moderate Islam, is just a question of institution. There's no such thing as clericalism in Sunnism. Mm-hmm. So who is legitimate and who is not legitimate? Yeah. Is the rector of Al-Azhar, the oldest university in the world, in Muslim world, 1053, created the same day as Cairo was created. Is he legitimate? In the new Egyptian constitution, he has the rank of prime minister. So he is institutionally legitimate, not only for Egypt, but a certain number of Sunni. Now the question is also can be raised with the King of Morocco, because the King of Morocco is the commander of the faithful. Again, he has a legitimacy not only in as king of the Sherifian, with a certain number of political and historical legitimacy coming from Morocco and having spread throughout the 18th century in Western Africa. The question is very acute in France, by the way, where we are raising this question: to whom do we speak? Who is legitimate? Are you legitimate because you have a mosque where you have a lot of faith believers? Or are you legitimate because you have worked on a certain number of issues, a certain number of let's say, a certain number of academical works? And the question that was addressed in France was addressed in the wrong way. We decided that someone who had in his mosque a certain number of believers per square meters were legitimate. I think we missed the point. And again, to address in one phrase, there is a beginning of something on which we can work on, the Council of Muslim Elders, in which you have political leaders as well as religious leaders, not only Muslim, but from all of the three religion, well, the three sacred religion, revealed religion, and they are working very actively to create an agenda, places where one can speak to the other, and of utmost importance to have a linkage with states and international organizations. That is to say, we are speaking a lot about multilateralism. I think we should speak more about plurilateralism. pluralism inside the international order, where in a certain number of international organizations, we're not taking sufficiently in consideration the fact that maybe the leadership is not only state-owned, it can be locally owned, it can be religious-driven, it can be motivated by something else than state ownership.
Thank you. I think at this stage I would like to take some questions from our audience. We're going to do gentleman, lady, or boy, girl, just to be fair. Gentleman right there.
Thank you very much to the speakers. My name is Adam Neumann from Kiel University, and I have a question to Emmanuel. I'm wondering, we spoke about the legitimacy that we had on the panel, who is really legitimate. And so when I think about the question of legitimacy, I want to ask you, Emmanuel, how do you consider the use of the word anti-Muslim racism, the use of racism, when used for people rejecting sort of Islamic or Muslim ideas and religion? If we consider that sort of who is really legitimate to speak for the Muslim world, is that word in your mind appropriate? Because if I have a race, I cannot change my race, but obviously I can choose a religion, at least in our country, and here you can do that. So should that word racism be continued to be used, or is that probably also weaponization of words? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question? Any other question? So they can respond to 2 questions at a time? Please.
Yes, of course, you're totally right. I think we're putting sort of buzzwords when it comes to Islam. For example, we have a tendency to not make a difference between Orient and Islam, forgetting that in Orient you have a lot of minorities, a lot of religious minorities. The Christians are one of them, and of course the Copts in Egypt and in Sudan. I think you're raising a question that is something that the politicians have not been capable or not willing to address during the last years. As I mentioned, the fact that a certain number of people, again I will focus on France, are Muslim, but they were coming more than Muslim states from states which was under the French rule, Algeria, Colonia, etc. And so when you speak to them, the immense majority do not consider themselves a Muslim. There is a minority which say that in France they are Muslim. They consider themselves primarily Algerians, Tunisian, Morocco, or Franco-Algerian, Tunisian, America. But again, there is a sort of narrative which a certain number of parties are using. I think it is the same narrative that must be fought against when it comes to fighting against radicalism on one side and populism on the other. Sometimes they are the same, it is the same drivers. We should invent a world, you're right, saying it's not about racism, it's in, I say, Islamophobia, for example. This is what the word we're using in France. It's very contradictory, but this is the word we're using. And to wrap up my my response and give you a bit of a perspective, I did mention the fact that one of the reasons why Islam is not considered sufficiently integrated as core of the European tradition, maybe we can address that question. Because a part of Europe is Muslim. Bosnia is Muslim, Albania is Muslim, and there are 1.5 million Turks in Germany. They represent something. I mean, they have a voice because they are Turkish and Germans, and again, they are not voting because they are Muslim or linked to Erdogan. They're voting because they feel they can be represented by someone or another one. I think we're not sufficiently addressing the issue of the change of the sociology of our societies. No society no longer is unicultural. Each society, everywhere in the world, is multicultural. So this is a question that the politicians should address when speaking to a certain people, a certain category of people who do not feel sufficiently French. Then there is the question of reciprocity. we are not interfering in the political or religious affairs of some countries. And one of the reasons why there is this form of racism, this form of antagonism with the Muslim, is because a certain number of countries are using that open door, this back door, to have an agenda. Both Turkey and Algeria in France, which are running the most mosques, Marseille for Turkey, and Paris, the oldest mosque in Paris, 1924, the Grande Mosquée de Paris. So this is very important. This is how France, for example, is addressing the question, saying that when it comes to the creation of Islam de France, there's two pillars on that. Organizational, as I mentioned, we need someone to speak with, and of course, the question of the capacity of having Republic and Islam being totally compatible. Quran cannot reform or cannot replace a constitution or a citizenship. That is what I call reciprocity.
Thank you. Now, if in fact working with moderate voices can advance the cause of addressing extremism, how are we supporting moderate voices, especially Islamic voices in Europe, to ensure, especially in the light of increased Islamophobia in some countries, to ensure that we can co-opt them into the process of countering violent extremism and terrorist ideology?
Well, there's 2 or 3 questions inside your integration. First question, how can we address better? We're already addressing the moderate voices, as, for example, to bring them to power. It's, again, a problem of medium range. And I think this opens to another question that we've been pinpointing all during our debates. The question between the opposition between Shia, for example, and Sunnism is not about religion. It's based on the fact that a certain number of countries, let's speak about the 90 million inhabitants of Iran, have gone to revolution in 1979, where all of the other Sunni countries, except Iraq, except Syria, we know what happened with Syria and what happened with Iraq, are not monarchies. They are republics. We may not like the leadership of one or the other. We choose to change the regime of the both, but I think this is an important point. It's, again, based on the fact that when you want to address this issue that the former president of Tunisia, Monsef Marzouki, addressed very well when he won the election in 2013. He wanted to modernize Islam and not Islamize modernity, which is something quite true because that is a political agenda. The other one is just taking consideration that we're living in a century where actors are changing, people are reassuming the fact that they want to have community building. I'm not saying this. Francis Fukuyama is saying this in his last essay, saying, I was wrong 30 years ago, saying that it was the end of history, last man, end of history, saying it is the return of ethics, it is the return of community, but it is, in a way, a sort of democratic regression.
Yeah, I would like to take another set of questions from the audience. Make it brief, perhaps 10 seconds, please.
My name is Alexandra Wojek. I am a publicist, and I have a question to the professor from Al-Azhar. How do you think, from your perspective, how Al-Azhar and you as a professor, as a lecturer, can support moderate Muslims?
French.
نحن أولا قبل الإجابة عليه نشكر أولا الدولة الفرنسية. أنا كنت في فرنسا ما لا يقل عن 35 سنة أعيش فيها وأعرف ما مضى في فرنسا. ثم بعد ذلك جاءت مشاكل. هذه مشاكل نسبت عن أناس لا يموتون بالصلة بهذا الدين الذي هو الإسلام. أناس ليس لهم أي ثقافة دينية إسلامية إلا ما يجدون في أنفسهم أن هذا هو الدين. فمثلا ما حدث في مالي الجميع يعرفه. أناس جاءوا من شرق البلاد ووقعوا على دولة مسالمة وقالوا إنهم مسلمون، وبدأوا ينفذون أحكاما تلقائيا، يجلدون أناس أبرياء. يكفي فقط أن يتهم إنسان بأنه سارق فيبدأون عليه بالجلد أو بأعمال أخرى شنيعة. والإسلام لا يبيح كل هذه الأمور، وهذه الأمور كلها بعيدة عن الإسلام. وقبل ذلك نحن نعرف ما حدث في أمريكا في نيويورك في 11 سبتمبر. لا أريد أن أرجع إلى تلك الأمور التي يحزن كل إنسان، لا نريد أن نرجع إلى هذه الأمور. قالوا هؤلاء مسلمون، ونحن ندرك بقرار الجميع أن هؤلاء ليسوا مسلمين، لكن أراد البعض أن ينسبوا هذا إلى الإسلام ويقولوا أن هذا من عمل المسلمين. هذا ما أريد أن أتكلم عليه وأقول للناس أنه من الواجب أن ندع الفرق بين الإسلام والذين يقومون بأعمالهم من تلقاء أنفسهم. ليس مصدر هذا العمل من المصادر الإسلامية ولا صلة لهذه الأمور بالإسلام. فما حدث في باريس فيما نسميه بباتاكلا، هل هذا عمل يجب أن نقول أن هذا من أعمال المسلمين؟ والذي حدث في شارلي إبدو هناك في فرنسا، هل هذا يمكن أن نقول أن هذا من عمل الإسلام؟ نحن قمنا في فرنسا بمحاربة هذه الأمور. على كل حال هناك من المتطرفين من جعل هذا الموضوع سلاحا لهم لمحاربة الإسلام، والإسلام بريء، والإسلام وجد نفسه في حرب لا كما يقول العرب سابقا لا ناقة لهم فيها ولا جمل. وهل هذا يجوز؟ هذا لا يجوز. لا يجوز أن نتهم الإسلام بكل ما ليس للإسلام يد فيه. فسؤال الأخت، أعتقد أن كل المسلمين الذين يجدون أنفسهم في هذا الدين المتسامح والذي نعرفه نحن، كما هو أنا من مواليد السنغال. السنغال 95% من المسلمين، 95% من المسلمين. وهل أحد من الناس سمع أن في السنغال فيه تعصب الديني أو تطرف الديني؟ أبدا. فهم يمارسون دينهم كما يجب وكما هو مفروض أن يكون. فالذي سمعناه في مالي والذي سمعناه في نيجيريا، أنا أعتقد بكل إخلاص أن هذا بعيد عن الإسلام ولا نؤيده، ولا أحد من المسلمين يؤيد تلك الأعمال.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'd like to apologize for some translation problems somewhere at the beginning. And thank you very much for staying with us, and thanks for the panelists. I would like to ask that you stay for our next session, which will start very shortly, and it's going to be on hybrid threats to our security, to start in about a minute or so. So please stay in your chairs, stay comfortably in your seats, and let's wait for the next moderator and the next set of panelists. Thank you very much.